This is the Leading the Mosaic World podcast. My guest today is Sue Fish, former Deputy Chief Constable of Nottinghamshire Police. Sue graduated from London School of Economics before joining Nottinghamshire Police in 1986, working with the service until her retirement in 2017. During her time with the service, she received 3 Chief Constable's commendations for professionalism, dedication, and courageous leadership. She also received the Queen's Police Medal for distinguished service in the 2016 birthday honours. Before her retirement from the police service in 2017, she was acting Chief Constable at Nottinghamshire Police for a period of time. Amongst other things, she now works as an executive coach, campaigner, and public speaker. During her tenure, she did some groundbreaking work around culture within the police force and wider society, inclusive of work that led to the recognition of misogyny as a hate crime in Nottinghamshire. Issues have recently been raised around the organisation culture of both London Fire Service and London Metropolitan Police. These issues, with all their complexities, undoubtedly affect other services and organisations more widely as well. They're critical for us to face and understand if we really want to move forward. Against this backdrop, I just had to invite Sue for a conversation to explore leadership in a mosaic world with me. Sue, thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Can I start off by asking you, around when and where were you born?
I was born in Leeds in 1962.
Okay, that was very precise. Not everyone wants to give their precise age, but so born in 1962. Did you grow up there?
No, my parents moved quite a bit, so I'm probably a child of the East Midlands, is what I would say. So I lived and went to school in most or 4 out of the 5 counties of the East Midlands. In fact, my parents moved slightly further south and then round the East Midlands. So yeah, probably I would describe the East Midlands as home. It still is.
And what was it like for you growing up in the East Midlands?
I had a really wonderful childhood. Amazing parents, brother and sister, and I think probably what would now be described as a very privileged upbringing. We lived in the country, we had horses, dogs, cats, you name it. And I had a really good education and a really safe, stable home life and an expectation, I guess, from my parents that I would, that I could succeed at anything I put my mind to. And I think, I look back and, at the time you never think you're fortunate, do you? Probably. But I look back and I was incredibly fortunate in terms of both my family and my upbringing and instilling probably into me those sorts of sense of determination and values, really strong sense of public service and wanting to make a difference. And I think probably some of it's also that I mentioned my brother and sister. I'm actually the middle one. So I think I probably got middle child syndrome, which is that I think it's the overachieving bit, because the first one, the new firstborn's always fantastic, isn't it? And the youngest is the baby and the wonderful one. And the one in the middle is always going, hello, what about me? What about me? And I think either I was very badly behaved or I was sort of super successful, but it was about getting noticed, I think, quite often, if that makes sense, without giving too much away or too much pop psychology.
Yeah, no, and that's interesting. I mean, I'm the youngest child, but I have heard about the middle child syndrome. And it's interesting because you have gone on to achieve so much. And I guess that started with you going to London School of Economics. And I'd love to know what led you there and what did you study there?
Well, I had quite a sort of checkered university career, I suppose it's fair to say, because I had a really great education, but I didn't like a couple of schools my parents sent me to. So I went to 3 secondary schools, and I went to a boarding school to start off with, and I kept on running away because I wanted to be at home with my horses. The second one, I was a day girl and then went sort of off the rails. And then I got sent to an all-boys boarding school. And when there were 13 girls in my year and 500 boys in the school, which was sort of character forming, I think. And I think that I am very competitive. I was very sporty as a child and as a young adult. So that sense of competition, and also being pretty comfortable, sometimes very uncomfortable, but generally comfortable in a very male environment, actually led me, first of all, to Oxford University. And I thought I was there to play sport, to row, to play hockey, to play squash, all of which I did quite successfully, and party. And so I actually forgot I was supposed to do any work. So that only lasted a year. I think we were mutually intellectually incompatible. I think the phrase, rather pretentious phrase, was I used in an application some years later. But it absolutely wasn't me in many senses. And so I had a year at home, then I ended up with glandular fever and stuff like that, and the sort of the normal sort of teenage, early 20s sort of overdoing it illnesses. And discovered I was overqualified for more or less everything because of my A-levels at that time, and underqualified because I wasn't a graduate. So people wouldn't take me seriously, or I didn't tick the right boxes. And so I thought, well, I better go back to university. And I wanted to go somewhere completely different from Oxbridge, and London seemed to hit the buttons. So LSE and studying politics and history, which I also had done at A-level, were my real loves. And I had an absolute ball there. Absolutely loved it academically, and still managed to play some sport and do, have the odd party as well. So that was a very positive, happy experience. But it was being there, I think, and being older, because I'd had a gap year after school. I went to America on a scholarship. Then all my friends, by the time I started at the LSE, those that hadn't had a gap year, and it wasn't really a thing back in 1980, 81, were all graduating, and most of them were going into the city to earn small fortunes, snort cocaine, drink champagne. Love that bit, the champagne bit. And my female friends, certainly, well, so were my male friends, but they didn't seem too fussed about it, were entertaining clients in strip clubs, lap dancing clubs, and absolutely loathed it. And this sort of obsession and pursuit of money for money's sake. And I know it's slightly more complex in economics than that, in terms of financial markets and all those sorts of things. But that just left me absolutely cold. And seeing the level of compromise, sort of ironically, that my friends were having to do professionally, said I needed to make some different career choices. So that was quite formative for me. So when I got summoned into, well, it's not summoned, but you get back in the day, you got a letter. I mean, obviously that wouldn't happen now, to go and see the careers people. And I thought, really, I'm nearly 24. I really ought to think about what I'm going to do to, earn a living, and I can't be a perpetual student and stuff like that. Well, I could have been, but I thought probably I better not be. And I'm a very nice careers person, did all these tests that they did in the day and listened to what I had to say. And I talk quite a lot about values and consistency with that. And she came up with two things: health service management and the police. And I don't mean this rudely, but I had no idea, I was so naive, that the health service had a management scheme. I mean, others could interpret it differently nowadays, but I had absolutely no idea. I thought it was just doctors and nurses because I was naive, ignorant, I think it's probably also fair to say. And so I said, the police sounds really interesting. And if Yvonne Fletcher had just been murdered outside the Libyan embassy at that time, my parents were absolutely horrified. And I said, no, I'm going to join Nottinghamshire Police. It's much it's much safer in Nottingham. And so I guess sort of the rest is history, really, because that's what I did.
Yeah. And thanks for that. I mean, I'm just thinking though, when we say police, even now, I think most people think of the police as being male-dominated, place where it's men. What made you feel comfortable to walk into work in such an environment?
I think probably a couple of things. Firstly, I think that sense of, and others might describe it as entitlement, but that fact that I felt that I could do anything I wanted to do. And it never occurred to me, partly because of the very fortunate education and upbringing I'd had, that those sorts of barriers weren't something that I really recognised or occurred to me. So they weren't there. So I just carried on regardless, if you like. And I hadn't discovered imposter syndrome at that point, I suppose it's fair to say. I hadn't got that level of self-awareness, probably. And also, as I said before, I went to a boys' school between 16 and 18, and the Oxford College I went to briefly was also a men's college that had just admitted women. So again, the ratios were very male-dominated, as were the academic staff at both places. So that didn't sort of faze me in that sort of way. And I think probably the final bit was I was really excited by this because it fitted with my values of making a difference, of serving the public, of wanting to help people, and also that sort of competitive, determined bit of me, which was I didn't know if I could do it. I knew I was reasonably bright. I knew I could talk my way into all sorts of stupid things and hopefully talk my way out of things. I was sort of physically confident and fit as a young woman, but I didn't know whether I could do it because it wasn't that it was, I guess that sort of emotional challenge. It probably wasn't a huge intellectual challenge, but there was lots to learn and stuff like that, obviously, but not in a sort of such an academic way. But it was, could I do it? Would I be good at it? Whereas I knew there were lots of other things I perhaps could have done that I could have done, but would I love it and enjoy it and be good at it? And that was sort of sense of the unknown. And you don't know what's going to come in every day. Yeah, okay, your police force would have X number of burglaries, robberies, rapes, indecent assaults, indecent exposures, road traffic collisions, missing people every day. But who were they going to be? Where were they going to be? How would they manifest? And what would be your role is very different. So there were sort of unsurprising operational surprises, and you didn't know how you were going to be tested, or how easy it was. And and you see people at their best, but you also mostly see people at their lowest and in the worst times of their lives, whether that's victims, often witnesses as well, traumatized by what they've seen, and indeed offenders. They're not all sort of happy, thrilled to bits that because, well, generally they've been caught when you're working with offenders as a police officer. So it was and still remains an incredibly challenging environment. And again, my first police station was in inner city Nottingham well, it's not a police station anymore, sadly, but called Canning Circus, and covered an area called Radford, which was quite challenging to police, in terms of community relationships, in terms of trust, in terms of confidence. And so whilst I was an individual police officer wearing a uniform, it was something also about how do you make yourself, build those individual relationships whilst you're also inevitably badged as what you do for a living, the uniform that you wear. And that was, again, another opportunity to really push myself out of my comfort zone, which I'm probably too good at, really. I'm quite happy operating in that bit out of comfort zone rather than going for safe and things like that. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. And I mean, there's possibly something positive about having the opportunity to do things that are are different, that are a challenge. I guess life doesn't get boring.
No, and it certainly wasn't. And my first couple of years as a probationary constable, as now as a student officer, were full of challenges, physically, emotionally, intellectually, getting my head around, what it is a police officer needs to do, how they need to be, the incidents and crimes that you went to, the people that you met, building relationships with colleagues as well as the public. In both parts, sometimes people that you really connected with, sometimes people you didn't.
And I'm just thinking, I worked with with London Fire Service for 2 years, and it's one of the organisations I've most enjoyed working with that sense of service that you mention. And people often these days talk about the negatives about the police and other services, but I'm just wondering from your perspective, what were the good things about working in that environment and the culture as a whole?
Yeah. Well, I think there's lots of positive things about the culture. That sense of camaraderie, that sense of teamwork, the sense of sort of backup and support, that you're not on your own. Others get the sort of challenges that you face, and you share that and support them. That sort of sense of common purpose I get at best. And feeling that you're making a difference. And that doesn't need to be by commendation or letters of thanks, but just knowing that that you've been there for someone, whether that's attending a sudden death and holding the widow's hand because her husband of 50 odd years has died, and and you've got forms to fill in and reports to make, but actually spending time listening and supporting people, or whether it's about getting a witness statement, a detailed witness statement from a rape victim, and then seeing a conviction or a guilty plea at court, because of the quality of evidence that you've been able to help share and present that best evidence at court, and see really bad people put away. That is hugely satisfying, knowing that you're keeping people safe, that you're helping to bring justice, and I won't necessarily say closure, but a sense of justice. Policing can't control sentencing, but actually seeing people brought to account for what they've done, I think is a hugely positive driver. It's often frustrated by sentencing, but that's or CPS deciding it's not in the public interest to prosecute, and it's really frustrating. And I won't go into sort of rape statistics and stuff like that now, but that, when it works, it's amazing. And latterly in my career, operationally, I was dealing with homicides and serious organised crime, knife crime or gun crime particularly, and seeing a reduction in the number of firearms discharges, seeing guns taken off the street, feeling that actually developing an evidence base that worked and knowing what didn't work and being able to help other forces. So I took on some national work, that sort of stuff. It really helps to get you out of bed every morning, because sadly good policing will always be needed, and being part of that, being able to make that difference, however difficult circumstances might have been for other reasons, always got me out of bed.
Yeah, no, and when you talk about being able to make a difference, doing things that has an impact, I guess there's not much more that you could do to have had a positive impact than the work that you did, especially as you said, you did work within Nottinghamshire, which had an impact on other forces, and work that you did nationally as well. But the only thing is, I guess, with all the good that you talk about, we had the Macpherson report over 20 years ago, after the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which raised concerns around institutional racism. Last year, with the fire service, we had Nazir Asfar's independent cultural review of the fire service, London Fire Service, that raised issues around misogyny, racism, all other issues about the culture. And more recently, we've had the Casey review of the Metropolitan piece that again raised similar issues. I mean, and I see these as deep-rooted cultural issues. I don't know whether you would say otherwise. I know you did work about, I always struggle with the word misogyny, but I know you did a lot of work about misogyny and actually made it a hate crime in Nottinghamshire. And I'm just interested in exploring those culture issues with you. And I just wonder, in professions, if we think of the services where people, I believe, are fundamentally out there to do good, to serve the public, where would you say, or where do you believe these negatives, these negative culture issues come from? How do they come about? And I might be asking you to solve one of the biggest problems of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Words on the backet of the fag packet, please. Yeah. I've talked a bit about the positives of the culture, but I think that, I would sum up the sort of the negative side of policing culture in terms of a really toxic masculinity. And that doesn't mean that there aren't a huge number of really decent men and women who've come into the service, remain in the service, tried to do their best for their communities with a really decent set of values and morals and principles and ways of behaving. But I think it's a very toxic, deep-seated part of the patriarchy, if you like. And I think you have to look back about why policing was created, and it was to protect men's property, of which women were one of them. Women weren't allowed to be police officers until early in the 20th century, and they were in a separate department. They looked after women and children's issues. They weren't paid the same. They didn't have practical uniform. And it wasn't until 1977 where the Sex Discrimination Act, the Police Women's Department was abolished and integrated, or in theory, or on paper, integrated into male policing. And of course, when you've done it on paper, that's all that you need to do, isn't it? So when I joined Nottinghamshire Police in 1986, it was 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act, I beg your pardon. It was 11 years after the Sex Discrimination Act and 9 years after the Equal Pay Act of 77. Women, I wasn't allowed to join if I was married. They wouldn't have had me. I was living in sin, as they put it, with the man who's still my husband. But I had to regularise the position, their words, not mine. But equally, if I'd have been married to him, they wouldn't have employed me. So I told them we were going to get married next year, which actually we did. It was nothing to do with them. So that's a bit about sort of flexible integrity already, I suppose. And they only had 8% of the force establishment as women, or 165, whichever was the fewer of these special people. So, there were illegal quotas. It was illegal about marital status, but this is the police. It doesn't matter. And I think there's that bit of policing is above the law. And there is a real element of that. And we are the law. And how that then plays out, and policing can be really tough, really challenging. But I think it is too often as well placed such a huge emphasis on loyalty, on not speaking out, on technical skills. So if you're a really good firearms officer, it doesn't matter how you behave. If you're a really good detective, it really doesn't matter how you behave. And actually, women, both in the service and women as members of the public, are lesser lesser beings. The sort of the sexualized, hyper-sexualized language and behaviours of many male officers. Sort of the van culture out of an evening will be commenting on how girls and women are dressed, what they would do with them, how they would do it, how many times, regardless of who's in that vehicle with them. And many male colleagues hate that, but they don't speak up and challenge because there is the power relationships are about those really toxic men. I won't say alpha men because I don't think they are alpha. I think they're just vile. But the power sits with them. And I saw that firsthand when I joined, and but in the context of race, because the most amazing detective constable who gave me so much support and encouragement and practical advice and all its mentoring, was a witness in the first race tribunal brought by a Nottinghamshire officer, by Surinder Singh, and this was a detective constable called Glenn, and Glenn was just the most wonderful man. And I say was because sadly he's no longer with us. But at the time, I was involved in a rape investigation, and I went to it went to trial at Lincoln Crown Court. So we all went in a minibus. There were a number of us, half a dozen or so of us, officers giving evidence. So we all went in a bus together to Lincoln from Nottingham. And no one would talk to Glenn because he was a witness in this. He'd done the unthinkable, which was speaking out. And I was the only person who would talk to him. And I was just horrified that how could they do that? Because I knew how much they liked him. I knew how much they respected him professionally. And yet this culture was this omerta, this, that he was completely ostracized and excluded because he'd done absolutely the right thing in my view, but a really hard thing, showing that sort of courage and bravery of speaking out I was going to say at a time, it's still a time when speaking out is professional suicide. And Surinder Singh won that tribunal because Nottinghamshire were racist in how they in how they treated him and others. A landmark case, and it still is. And I think that started to open my eyes. I talked about being relatively unaware or unself-aware about issues, and particularly gender, race, and I guess latterly I would add LGBTQ plus issues into that, disability as well, obviously. But I was sort of naive and ignorant and just sort of thought, well, you sort of, if you try hard enough, you'll succeed. And all of a sudden, it's not that simple. And the sort of the obstructions that were in the way, of me joining the police, because others, for example, would have walked away. Oh, well, I can work around that and make that work for me because I was that, because that's how I'm made. I will make it work. I'll get through it. You show me an obstacle. You show me a hill. I'll go, right, I'll go over that. I'll go around it. I'll go under it. I'll make it happen. I'll solve that problem. That's fine, but it's blinking hard work. Others are probably far more sensible and make different decisions. But also then seeing that cost firsthand for others, both in terms of Surinder and other colleagues who weren't able to, the institutional barriers were there. And actually there weren't any women on firearms at the time. And the chief inspector who became the chief inspector at Constabulary was our local inspector who came and famously inspected Nottinghamshire Police's firearms unit, who very proudly had just appointed their first woman. And what, have you run out of fucking men then? Quote unquote. And one of the reasons I left Nottinghamshire and went to the West Midlands on promotion to superintendent was I couldn't be a firearms commander in Nottinghamshire because the policy said you had to have been a firearms officer. And given they'd had 2 or 3 by then, statistically, it wasn't going to be me. I was also on the fast track scheme by then, so that was never going to be me because you didn't have that ability. Well, I suppose I could have chosen to step off that sort of hamster wheel promotion thing. Yeah, so I made different choices, and I was very fortunate that I could make some different positive choices as opposed to becoming bitter, angry, more oppressed, because those choices weren't open to me, and I'm very conscious that I've been able to make and take those opportunities that maybe others have not felt able to do.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking when people talk about institutional racism, and I think the whole culture, the things that are institutional, the treatment of women, treatment of people of colour, sexual orientation. Would it be fair to say that you've actually just done a good job of describing some of those institutional barriers whereby it's not so much about individuals and how they behave, but the structures that are in place within organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that term institutional racism or institutional anything else doesn't refer to individual officers or staff. This is about policies, processes, the way that it's done. And whilst many of my former colleagues would say, but it's not like that now. It's not like that now. There'd never be 8% quota of women, Yeah, get that. But what are the other ones? There are new ones. There are different ones. There are ones that we're starting to unpeel. It's a bit like an onion layer. Those were the sort of the blindingly obvious ones. As opposed to how do you build your networks? How do you get the overtime and stuff like that? I was also told I wasn't allowed overtime. Only when I challenged it, because I said, why haven't I been offered this overtime? Well, because I was married to someone and we were a double income family, I was told. These men with wives at home and their children need the money more than you do. Well, it's still happening. If you read the Times this week, there was exactly that in an employment tribunal. Not in policing, in the private sector. But, it's still that same mentality and about how women are viewed. And it's how women, how Black people, how gay people, how disabled people are viewed by the institution and are not thought about by the institution. The norm, the model, the intellectual, visual model of who a police officer is male and white and straight and able-bodied. And that is both far from the truth and it shouldn't be like that. But that's the construct on which society, our laws, our policies are based. And so when you try and suggest we need things like a menopause policy, or actually we need to look at misogyny differently, we need to look at sexual misconduct by police officers differently as opposed to it being a perk of the job. Oh my God, you talk about, you asked earlier about could I have done more? And the answer is yes. I think I tried at the time to do loads, and I thought I was doing loads, and I look back and go, God, you didn't even scratch the surface.
But actually, you did do a lot, and specifically in relation to misogyny. I know I haven't said that properly. I don't know why. I've got something in my head that I struggle with that word.
I can't spell it. Does that help?
Okay, well, at least, yeah. But I'd love for you to talk a bit about what you did in that space, because I think it's fair to say it was groundbreaking, because you got it made into a hate crime. That's not a small achievement. I mean, that's not a small achievement at all. So I'm curious, how did you achieve that?
I think doing what policing rarely does, which is really listen and hear what you're being told by the community and also what the evidence is telling you. Policing is really good at being selective about it, the evidence it chooses to acknowledge. Casey report. I rest my case. But I chose to listen to and really hear what it's our local chapter of Citizens UK in Nottingham did. They did a piece of work on hate crime and particularly not just about people's experience of hate crime, but about policing's response. And it told me, nothing we didn't know, which sounds quite arrogant, but in that it's underreported. We're not very good at dealing with it. And if it is reported, those who are victims really aren't very impressed with how policing's dealt with it. So it's not great, but that was what we already knew. What we didn't know, or what I didn't know, I probably would have done if I'd thought about it. I was too busy dealing with other stuff, to be fair. What that obviously was really important was that women experience hate crime differently. They also report it far less. And then if you play intersectionality, horrible word, but you play that in, so if you're a black woman, you will experience it differently to a white woman. If you have a disability, if you're a gay woman, if you're a trans woman, you will experience it differently. And that policing were failing women far more than they were failing men. And hearing that on the scale and depth that the evidence was presented, my argument to the chief officer team was, we can't just sit there and go, yeah, thanks for that. We need to do something about it. And so we made the decision. I think probably technically I made the decision, but I was the deputy at the time, and the chief said, "Yep, I'm happy to go with that. But it's your decision, so it's all my fault if it went wrong." And that was fine. And we made the decision. It wasn't straightforward. Not everyone went, "Oh God, this is such a great idea." All the questions about with the morality police. We don't take a moral high ground. Who does? Who says that behaviour is unacceptable when it's reported in terms of the harm and that it's caused? And the prevalence of this sort of behaviour. I mean, we were really talking much more about street harassment, but it also reflected online stuff. But again, we're talking 8 years ago now. So, online activity has developed and worsened inevitably over that time as well. So we worked with partners. Our local women's centre as well was absolutely fantastic. We worked with a whole range of women's groups because it was 2014 through to 2016 when we went live in planning how we were going to implement this, because some domestic abuse groups were really concerned that we would take away funding or focus of effort. And this absolutely wasn't. This was about how we understand some of those early behaviours and work to be preventative, more educational. Because again, women were saying, well, we don't want, it wasn't about throwing all men into jail for wolf whistling or saying, oh, this is what I want to do with my bit of my anatomy up your bit of your anatomy, in fairly graphic terms. So we worked really closely with other people, and then we developed a training program using academic best practice or academic evidence as best practice. And we trained our control room staff first. Now, our control room staff are disproportionately women, but they're the people who field all the calls when you phone in, whether it's on 39s or on 101. And we were sort of quite apprehensive as to how it would go. And we were happily relieved that they were, oh my God, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to my daughter, this happened to me. And this is so brilliant. And they absolutely got it. And then some of the men who went, really? Does this happen? I know this is what happened to me. This is our experience. And this is what we do. This is our safety planning. This is why we always text our daughters. This is why we get our girls' phones. It's not so they can send, naked shots themselves. It's so they can text me to say I've got home safely, or I'm leaving now, mum, or whatever. And how many men have to even think about that? Very, very few. And so, the training rolled out And we went live in 2016, and according to the Today programme on Radio 4, I'd outlawed wolf whistling. So I was really quite stroppy with them, because now that's supposed to be the flagship news programme for the country, isn't it? I think.
There's a lack of nuance in that thinking.
Well, there's a lack of everything in that, because, I can't make up the law, so how can I make something unlawful? And focusing on wolf whistling around the range of behaviours, but it made a cheap headline. And many of my national colleagues from other forces, because I was temporary chief by then, were absolutely appalled, because we should be focusing on burglary and robbery, because women aren't really important. We're 50% of the population or slightly more. But we're actually not important. Our voices aren't important. Our lives aren't important. Our level of compromise isn't relevant. Yeah, I had some support from colleagues, but I also had far more, and some of the very powerful people in policing, not least the then chair of the National Police Chiefs, Sarah Thornton, and the then Commissioner of the Met, Cressida Dick, both came out and said, as women, as well as senior police officers, the two most senior in the country, to be fair, went, oh no, this, we need to bear down. It sounds like they're constipated, doesn't it? Bear down on vehicle crime and burglary. And oh, for goodness sake, get over yourselves. This isn't an either or. And there were all the reasons in the world why we shouldn't do it. It's a tsunami of stuff. We're being overly sensitive. It's a left-wing liberal intellectual elite. It's absolute rubbish. This is about women's everyday experience. If you follow Laura Bates and Everyday Sexism Project, you look at n number of research projects. It's 98% of women aged between 16 and 30 have been subject to this sort of behaviour.
And we're not talking about the whistling. We're talking about more serious
stuff, and the harms that causes, and the escalator of offending. Because of course, men can behave with impunity because there's no sanction, or men who choose to behave like that, and the good men, of which the vast majority are, don't call them out for the reasons, I think, that I talked about in policing. Is the fear of being excluded, the fear of being ostracised, fear of being teased, as opposed to actually being really clear about that behaviour is unacceptable. Why would you behave like that? What were you trying to achieve? Because, there's sort of the hashtag of not all men. I mean, it's just a bit like hashtag White Lives Matter too. You've missed the point. Absolutely missed the point. And I think there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done around the role of male allies and men being more assertive about what is acceptable and what isn't in terms of behaviours. I think is so important. Because this is, and let's face it, this is men's problem to solve. This is male violence against women and girls. Yet I'm a woman, I'm talking about it, and we're women talking about it because it happens to women. We need far more men to step up and to talk about what good looks like, or to understand, or to ask what good look like. But actually, I think if men apply themselves, they know exactly what it looks like. I think there's such an opportunity here, not just for schools, not just for parents, not just for peers, but for every man, every boy, to think very differently about what sort of world they want to live in, because we've currently got this sort of world where it's kind of where it's much more accepting of so much, but it's so much less tolerant of other things. And so I think it's that bit about being able to have a debate and have a discussion, and sometimes to disagree as well, but to do so constructively, instead of in terms of personal attack and denigrating people and being abusive. I think, that's absolutely hopeless. So actually being able to debate issues is so important. But for men to be engaged in this debate of male violence against women and girls, I think is absolutely critical if we're going to shift the dial.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, Male Perspectives on the Value of Women at Work. So the male voice, as opposed to just women having the conversation. It doesn't talk about violence, but it's just the value that women bring. And it is interesting to me when you were talking about the process that you followed in Nottinghamshire, and I sort of made a few bullet points. So there's just something about asking the questions, the key questions, listening to the response, and I would almost say listening deeply, and listening deeply and questioning deeply, so you understand the intersectionality, the complexity of issues, acting with stakeholders, recognizing the nuance of what you're dealing with, being about change in partnership, and training people so that they can play their part. But as you say, the other part that I made a specific note of was the lack of awareness of men. And so there's the bit about the allyship, but it does, as you said, need the conversations. It needs the engagement for men to really understand what the issues are, because one of the things that I found is there are a lot of issues, whether it's the violence or whether it's the difference in the ways in which women navigate the workplace or what have you, that men really don't understand. We think they should, but they don't. So I think when you speak about the need for dialogue, that is important. There's the other bit where you mentioned women in position of leadership who say it's not a problem. You cited the example of Cressida Dick, and that the view is women just have to, I guess, be stronger, stand up, and just learn how to navigate through. I mean, I don't even know what my question is in relation to them. I mean, do they have a point? Because if we talk about the case of the work that you did in Nottinghamshire about misogyny, making a hate crime, if it was such an issue that really should be on the forefront of people's minds across police forces and more broadly, why haven't more people taken it up? Why isn't it a hate crime across the nation?
Well, we chose to do it because we can. So there are legally protected characteristics that are part of hate crime legislation. But there's also things like alternative lifestyles, so subcultures, which is sort of goths, emos, punks, that sort of thing, which was born out of the awful murder of Sophie Lancaster and the wonderful campaigning her mother, Sylvia, did. And every force went, oh, that's the right thing to do. And it was. My force did it. It was the right thing to do. But do that about women? Oh, no. Oh, no. They're not a minority, are they? They're actually a majority. It's deliberately obtuse and denying the reality of women's experiences. That's not to say, I reach the top of my profession. Lots of other women do. That's not the issue. And I think there's an awful lot of pressure put on women in senior positions, in any position, frankly, to say everything's fabulous. And for years I did too, publicly. The cost of not was too high. So I think, we need to think about why and what we're trying to do. But actually, since we made in Nottinghamshire misogyny a hate crime, half the forces in the country now have misogyny or gender as a hate crime. And so that has been taken up by choice by so many police forces around the country. And I'm really delighted with that. But it's still postcode lottery. What we saw last year, just over 12 months ago, was actually the House of Lords voted in favour of an amendment in the domestic abuse bill of its day, to make misogyny a hate crime. Now, I find the sort of the irony of an unelected chamber, which has traditionally been the sort of the more, with a very small c, conservative end of the political spectrum, actually voting for a much more radical piece of legislation being thrown out by an incredibly right-wing government who were whipped when that amendment went back to the House of Commons and were whipped to say no. You know, when you've got, at the time, then the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, who didn't know what misogyny was. I mean, you may not be able to pronounce it. I might not be very good at spelling it, but we know what it is, for goodness sake. And you've got the Prime Minister on daytime telly or morning telly going, we're not going to make misogyny a hate crime. Well, at least he's talking about it. I mean, really bad decision, in my view, because it's not the answer. This is sort of, if you like, this is one of the foundation blocks to build that wall, to build whatever it is. I don't know whether it's a wall, it's a building, it's a something that is going to stop male violence against women and girls. And this is, it's a first step. It's as simple as that. It's not the answer. We never pretended it was. But, you know, it's exactly the same as why Mark Rowley didn't accept the institutional labels of the Casey report, because politically he was under such huge pressure from the Home Office and Number 10 not to. You know, and that is quite well documented and established now. Yeah, and that is wholly wrong. What we saw post Macpherson was a government that said there is political imperative about acknowledging the findings of Lord Macpherson's report and doing something about it. Whereas now, you know, I've known Mark for years. I know his deputy, Lynn, well. You know, they are good people, but it's in a very different political world. And in a very different organisation to try and deliver that sort of seismic change when the sort of the technical stuff, the burglaries, the robberies, policing a coronation or whatever, or Just Stop Oil or whatever, the flavour of the month is, suddenly becomes a priority. Actually, the priority is about legitimacy of policing within our communities. We police by consent. And I didn't say this earlier, but this has been something that has driven me in some of the more, what were seen as radical, I think blindingly obvious, but I wouldn't I, things that I moved forward when I was in policing. So treating sexual misconduct by police officers as something incredibly serious and completely non-negotiable within our force. At a time when it wasn't viewed as corruption, it wasn't viewed as serious. It was viewed really still as a perk of the job, and because who doesn't love a man in uniform? Just outrageous. And police officers can't really behave like that, or if they do, it's big. Well, they're under pressure. They have a really difficult job, or she was a real cow, or she burnt his dinner. And police officers don't really commit domestic abuse. Well, they might. But it doesn't really matter because he's a fantastic detective or he's a fantastic firearms officer, and we're short of firearms officers. So actually, and he's mates with this chap who's investigating it, so we'll just brush it under the carpet. So that for me, yes, it's about sexual misconduct, but what impact does that have? Not just a traumatic one on the victim and an ongoing one, but on trust and legitimacy of policing in terms of protecting the most vulnerable in society and being trusted to do so. And so I think for me, that's been such a driver, not just with sexual misconduct, with misogyny, with a whole raft of work that I've done through my career. And certainly the second half, when some of the scales fell from my eyes, has been so important. And I think that's the bit that is the complete miss. And we may go on and talk a bit more about the Casey report in terms of Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Met's response to the Casey report, in terms of not acknowledging the scale and depth of the issues, that they are institutional, as Casey set out so very clearly. And then he sort of compounded that by saying when he was in charge of counter-terrorism, including the DPG, which is where Cousins and Carrick et al. operated, then he never saw anything or heard anything that was in any way misogynistic or racist. Well, Louise Casey walked in there and saw stuff on the walls. So there is, we talked about men and good men, and indeed good women in policing don't always see it either. Yeah, they don't necessarily have that lived experience that if you're black, you're gay, you're a woman, you're disabled, but they have a responsibility. And certainly as a police officer, I think everyone, it doesn't matter whether you've just started as a police officer, the duty and the responsibility are still the same as to whether you're the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, to see and to hear.
So a couple of things came to mind as you were talking. The first was, even though you're talking about this in the context of the police, it's not just within the police. These are issues that affect people in organizations across different industries. You mentioned what was going on in the city earlier on, and there are people that affect, there are things that affect people in all areas of society. So even though we're talking about the police, it has global relevance. And so that's the first thing that came to mind, almost as a reminder to people. But the second thing is the cost of speaking out. Because you mentioned that a lot of men don't speak out. Good men don't speak out because of the concern that they have about being ostracized. You also mentioned that earlier in your career, you didn't speak out as well. At first, you were working around it, and then there was a point where you didn't feel able to speak out. More recently, you have Ian Livingstone, who is the outgoing Chief Constable of Scotland, who made a public statement saying that Scottish police is institutionally racist. And there is something that happens about people not speaking out. I mean, because the question is, why didn't he speak out earlier? Why did you feel unable to speak out earlier? Earlier in your career, Ari, and we're asking men with that fear of being ostracized. And I'm just thinking, what do we do to overcome the barrier? What do you say to people that feel unable to speak out? How do we work to overcome that barrier in the police and anywhere else where people are afraid to speak out, whether it's because of political pressures or anything else?
For a million dollar question, isn't it? I think you're right. This has much broader application than just in policing. But if we just stay in policing, so policing has all the policies, all the whistleblowing lines, all the everything it's supposed to do as good practice. But actually, it's completely, again, misses the point because it doesn't take into account culture. And so it absolutely needs to be turned on its head. I mean, I think there's something fundamental about policing, which is the role of the Federation, which is the staff association that supports chief inspectors down to constables. And the purpose for which it's set up is clear on its website. And one of the purposes is to support officers as their friend through any misconduct proceedings and things like that. What you find is that they disproportionately spend a fortune of their members' money defending the indefensible. Everyone needs a fair trial and is entitled to that sort of support. I absolutely get that, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but they fail to support victims when they're also their members. So if they spend half as much time, effort, money and interest in protecting their members who are victims as opposed to their members who are perpetrators, I think that would be a really important first step. So, yeah, it was really interesting. The chair of the National Federation actually acknowledged that he believed, I can't remember now whether it was just the Met or policing, he is a Met officer as well, is institutionally racist and sexist. And I thought, oh, hallelujah, hallelujah. Okay, it's only words, but it's an acknowledgement, because that bit about not being able to see is one thing. So why don't people speak out? Well, I didn't speak out a lot because, or I chose who I spoke to. What is speaking out, I suppose? Is it telling someone else? Is it telling a friend? Is it telling the boss? Is it telling the system? Is it telling a local newspaper? Or is it doing a podcast? Is it doing it on Twitter? What is speaking out? Is also that lack of support. So, I think for any member of the public as well who wants to call out bad behaviour, it's seen as sort of an occupational hazard in policing that you get complaints. And, well, they would make a complaint, wouldn't they? Because, they'll try and get off whatever the criminal charge is, because they're all bad. And yes, there are some people who game the system like that. But actually, most people are really affronted by how they have been treated. And if you're making allegations around sexism, sexual misconduct, domestic abuse, these need to be understood much more seriously. And I don't think they should be investigated by the same police force. I used to think that was all fine. I don't think so. I think the networks are far too ingrained. This needs seismic rethinking, reworking of the whole sort of complaints, crime investigation system when police officers are the alleged perpetrators. And it also needs a completely different mindset about victim support. The equivalent of IDVAs or advocates for people. And I think probably for every rape victim, whether the perpetrator is a police officer or not, I would also be saying that would be really important, because navigating the system, having that sort of support and understanding is so important. But it's also about leadership at work. So if you are a victim at work, or you're someone who's witnessed something and called it out, it's really difficult. And I've talked publicly about some of my experiences. So, and I talked earlier about challenging why I didn't get overtime. That was speaking out, I think. Not very loudly, but clearly to the person who needed to hear it. I didn't actually want to do the overtime. That wasn't the point. The point was I wasn't actually considered, understanding why I wasn't considered, and that was wrong. So it's being given choice, isn't it? It's being treated as an equal, as opposed to being discriminated against because of your gender or of your race, or whatever the reason is. So it is so complicated. But I think, for policing, it needs a complete root and branch change from how we recruit, how you define what you want from a police officer in the 21st century. And the tinkering that the College of Policing has done in terms of reworking the code of ethics and the values. I mean, yeah, great. But that's policy, that's process. That's not about culture change. What are the actions that are really necessary to stop accepting and dismissing the poor behaviour and the criminal behaviour of police officers, and the dreadful experience at the hands of police officers of members of the public who are women, and indeed their colleagues, their female colleagues, be they officers or police staff. And that sort of understanding of police officers aren't necessarily heroes. I think we've also got this sort of mindset of police officer heroes, this thin blue line bit, and everyone hates us. The left-wing press, no one ever says positive things in the media about policing. They never do anything well. It's just police bashing the whole time. And don't you know how hard it is on the streets, because, people spit at us and stab us and kill us and run us over and stuff like that. It's hell. So there's this real sort of hero mentality. And police officers can do really heroic things, but most of policing's quite mundane. It can be really challenging, can be really difficult, but that's not policing all the time everywhere. And the other bit is that sort of concept of the monster police officers, so Carrick or Cousins. And the rest of us aren't like that. It's the bad apple theory. And that's not helpful as a narrative either, because, I mean, I still, despite all my experience as a cop, believe in the goodness of people. And I am an eternal optimist about things. So they were made like that. You know, they weren't born like that, actually, the whole of life, but no one's ever intervened. So their escalation continues, or when there are opportunities to intervene, they were believed and victims weren't, which left them, you know, completely at liberty to behave as they wanted, and they did. So that monster narrative, I think, is equally unhelpful. It's about thinking, actually, that capability is in everyone. And what do we need to do to recruit, to train, to build, to identify, you know, the sort of police officers we want, that the public need to deliver policing services for the 21st century, not some arcane model that's been cobbled together from a male perspective over the last 200 years, which is really what we've got now, where technical ability triumphs over empathy, decency, and doing the right thing.
And I couldn't agree with you more. I did start off by talking about the fact that there are deep issues, deep-rooted issues. And as you said, there's a focus on the police, but it's a wider issue across different industries. If we can deal with it in the police, then potentially that gives a framework in other areas in the workplace. And I've come to the same conclusion as you, that we can't change things by just tinkering. We need to take the time to understand the structures, how the structures are created by men for men, and really review and understand what needs to change and how. And I guess that requires leadership, a leadership that really is open to facing the issues and is really looking towards solutions. So there's a lot there, and it's a journey. And just coming close to a conclusion, I'd love to know, because you're retired, but you continue to campaign, you continue to speak about the issues. What motivates you not to just quietly retire and enjoy the rest of your time on this earth? And
it's probably all the things that got me into policing in the first place. That, you know, I am still very driven to make a difference, and it matters. I'm still really angry about how policing, some of the really poor aspects of policing. I really believe in good policing. And I think that it's that belief in really good policing and public service more broadly that keeps me motivated. And I think there are things that small things I can help and continue to make that difference with. And part of that's got me to agree to help a public sector organisation to continue to improve. And I work in third sector and private sector organisations to continue that in some small way, because it is really important to me and my values. I am very values driven. Once I learned that phrase, I didn't quite know what it was back in the day, but that's what's driven me, and it continues to do so. Yes, it manifests slightly differently nowadays, given that I'm sort of I can choose what I do, but I choose to do this because it really matters, and I think the future really matters. For future generations of women and girls and of men. So, that's why I do it.
What would you say to the man, the girl, or the woman in the police force or any other organisation where there's a culture that is not inclusive, it's not fair, it's abusive in whatever shape and form? They don't like it, they want to change, things to change, but they just don't know how to speak out because of the wider culture.
I think it's sort of build your allies and it's build your allies and network, isn't it? And that sounds simple because the obvious answer is call it out. Well, it's not that simple. So I think it's about building your allies and network and working out who you can trust. And there are those three responses to dominance, aren't there? You know, you run away, you fight it, or you acquiesce. And those choices, I think, are all reasonable choices. And I wouldn't judge anyone for making any of those choices because there are costs to all of them. And there were times when I either didn't see stuff or I acquiesced, because actually if you fight every battle, you're absolutely exhausted, you're dead in a ditch long before you get to what's really, really important. But I think it's build those networks, and I think every police force now, has women's networks. It probably has a branch of the Black Police Association or different support networks that will be able to help and should be a trusted ear if you're looking for people. And I hope that police forces are starting to put in place the sort of arrangements that are radical enough to mean that trusts can be developed about calling out those sorts of behaviours. I don't know because I'm not involved directly in policing anymore, but it's those sorts of things so that you build that sort of sense of what's possible, and you understand where your allies are and those who you can trust. And if there aren't any, then you're probably not in the right place for your own health and well-being. And as I said, I wouldn't judge anyone from opting out either of policing altogether, and so many do, sadly, and so many good people, as opposed to bearing the costs of staying. And people, I remember someone saying to me, policing needs you much more than you need policing. And I've ended up saying that to so many women who've either left or considering leaving because of their circumstances. And that's not a good enough reason to stay, because if you don't look after yourself, no one else is going to. And that's not selfish. I think that's self-preservation. And I have seen how disruptive policing can be to those who call stuff out. And that's appalling. Which is why I would never judge someone for the choices that they make. They have to make the right choices for themselves and their circumstances.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much overall for a very deep, thought-provoking conversation. Just to conclude, if people want to connect with you or contact you, how do they go about doing so?
Either through LinkedIn or through email. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, but that's a private one. That's just for friends, shows my age if I'm on that. Instagram's private as well. So my professional bits are LinkedIn and Twitter. So that's good. Or via email I'm Susanna, which is SUSANNAH at starfish-consulting.co.uk. And if you Google me, I have a holding page on my website. It's not a website that's interactive or whatever, but it gives some of my contact details as well. So be delighted to hear from anyone.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated and enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you very much for asking me and asking such thought-provoking questions.
I don't know how to do anything else.
You give me a full intellectual workout and emotional workout, so thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Leading in the Mosaic World podcast. Do visit our website at www.misconduct.co.uk mosaicworld.live to find out more about what we do and how we can be of support to you. Alternatively, connect with me, Susan Popoola, spelt Popoola, on LinkedIn, and let me know what you think of the podcast. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, give it a first-class rating, and tell everyone you know all about it. Thank you.